Blackmore likes the compatibilist position and thinks that maybe the problem in accepting the compatibilist position is consciousness and the role that we think consciousness needs to play in our actions. And so in considering this, she suggests that people have this false view of how free will needs to go, and particularly the libertarians who think that we might be able to consciously choose to either do a particular action or not do a particular action. So I'm sitting there at the restaurant and I can choose either the tomato soup or the grilled cheese. And at that moment that I choose the tomato soup, I could have chosen to get the grilled cheese, and consciousness is what pushed me towards the tomato soup instead of towards the grilled cheese. And this is part of the reason why it seems like it's free will, because our consciousness is having this effect, and it seems like the physical causes couldn't prevent me from choosing grilled cheese if I really wanted to have grilled cheese. That already suggests this, this previous cause, like what made me want to have one or the other. In thinking about your choices, thinking about what role consciousness plays and whether it's consciousness that's pushing you one way or pushing you another way, and whether it could push you either way at the moment of decision is part of the question here. And so in looking at this question, we can think about the folk view of free will as your conscious decision making being the cause of your action. So we have this guy here who's having this conscious thought, I'm going to have tomato soup, and the folk idea is that it's that kind of conscious mental state, maybe a dualist kind of view, that then intervenes in the physical world and causes your motor response, your brain, to choose then to have this action. But then this view, this folk view of free will, gets complicated by science, as so much of our folk views do, and also gets complicated by Libet. And we saw Libet earlier in thinking about dualism, and his view suggested a kind of dualism. Here Libet's experiments undercut a kind of dualism, or at least create problems with a kind of dualism. So to do this exercise, you should practice this at home to kind of get a sense of how this experiment went. You'll see a clock. This is the Libet clock, and it's a red dot circling around a clock. And what you should do is put your hand out in front of you, so put your hand out like this, and just make a conscious decision to flex your wrist, every so often. And look at the place on the clock where the red dot is, and just practice flexing and then looking at what, where the dot is on the clock. That's the subject's perspective of this experiment, that the subject chooses, I'm going to flex my wrist, and then looks at where on the clock that dot appears. As Blackmore mentioned, that's the difficult part of the experiment, figuring out where the subject, at what time the subject is choosing to flex the wrist. And so this Libet clock is Libet's solution to solving that problem, because the other two parts of the experiment are quite easy to measure. So you measure the time of the flexing, so you look at the wrist muscle movement, and then you can set up an EEG, some kind of measurement to monitor when the brain activates the motor cortex to send a signal to the arm to move. All right, so we've got an objective measure of when the brain is moving and an objective measure of when the wrist is moving. And so the clock measure then is the objective measure, trying to get the objective measure of the subjective decision to flex the wrist. And Libet calls that W, and talks about the initiation of the arm movement as RP. That's the readiness potential. That's when the brain is getting ready, firing up the neural system in order to move. And so you can look at this diagram to see the temporal order of events, starting at 0, measuring from 0, which is when the wrist moves, that's movement onset, and looking prior to that, about 206 milliseconds, a couple hundred milliseconds before the wrist movement, the person has this W judgment that they think, okay, I'm going to move my wrist, and then the wrist moves 200 milliseconds later. But another 300 milliseconds before that, so 500 milliseconds before the movement, you have the readiness potential onset. You have the brain gearing up to move. A good 500 milliseconds before you move and 300 milliseconds before you have this judgment, this decision that you are going to move. So this study and a number of other studies that we've seen suggest that it takes some time from the point of sensation or from the point of initiation of action before consciousness appears, if there is such a thing. Remember, Dennett suggests that trying to time consciousness is a fool's errand. But if the scientist is right and there is consciousness and there's a moment of consciousness, it looks like that moment of consciousness is delayed relative to sensory input and relative to action initiation. And so with respect to the question of free will, it raises the problem of how could consciousness cause action if consciousness appears later than the initiation of action. So it looks like the actual order of events is that motor response is initiated first, then there's a conscious decision, and then there's an action. As long as the conscious decision appears before the action, it still seems to us as if consciousness is causing the action because the consciousness happens right before the action. It doesn't happen afterwards. So we still have the sense that our consciousness is causing something even if the initiation of the action happens prior to that conscious decision to act. So, consciousness is taking time. What is it that consciousness could possibly be doing? Could consciousness play any role? The argument is that it doesn't. Libet himself suggested maybe consciousness could have a veto, that you didn't have free will, but you had free won't, that in the time between initiation of action and actual action, maybe you could decide not to, would that be sufficient? You have the option of either acting or not acting, but you don't actually have control over the action, or you don't cause the action yourself. So you can ask yourself, is that sufficient for freedom? Is free won't sufficient for you? A final study by Daniel Wegner casts some doubt on the question of whether your feeling of willing could play any role at all, even having free won't. And he looked at the way in which you could set up an experiment so a person didn't have control at all over an action, but yet felt like they had control over an action. So you set up a person and a Confederate, and I think that you're part of the study, but you're actually working with the with Wegner in setting up the study. And so the Confederate person is determining where the Ouija board mechanism stops, but I have in my ear a word that appears to my consciousness right before we stop at that word. And so because that word appears in my consciousness and then we stop at that word, I get the feeling that I caused us to stop at that word. Even though I wasn't the one who came up with that word, that was predetermined by the experiment that, the word cat would come up and the Confederate would take the Ouija mechanism to the cat and would stop there. Simply having this conscious experience prior to stopping at that word would be sufficient to give me the sense that I caused that to happen. And Wegner then hypothesizes that there are 3 things that are necessary for us to have the experience of conscious willing, and they are entirely disconnected from any fact about conscious willing. So those 3 things, those 3 components of the feeling of willing are: first, the unconscious process initiates the action, and the unconscious process can be me physically, or it can be something outside of me. It can be this Confederate in this case. And then second, this causes the conscious thought about the action, and then third, the action occurs. So there needs to be some cause of an action, and my conscious thought about it needs to happen before the action, and then the action needs to happen. But it's those 2 factors, that you have a conscious thought prior to the action, and that simple association is going to be sufficient to give you the feeling that you were the cause. And he talks about this as epiphenomenalism, that your consciousness doesn't have any effect. It doesn't cause the action to occur. It's simply extra, that all of the causes of action are happening without consciousness. And so, that raises then the question, is your consciousness able to cause action? Do you have free won't, at least, in relation to your own actions? Or is everything happened by your brain and you have no control at all? We can also ask, is there another way to think about physical causation other than a kind of determinist causation? How can we think about indeterminism in a way that's not mere randomness? Because mere randomness doesn't get us what we want, but indeterminism in physical causation might leave us some wiggle room to have some role of mental events, mental states causing things to happen. In our reading for next time, Roskies offers another way to think about free will. She talks about agency, and so you can think also about whether agency is sufficient to be a substitute for free will, for the traditional notion of free will, or whether there would be something missing if consciousness doesn't cause your action, if you don't at every conscious moment have the possibility of doing what you do or doing some other thing. When, and this is the timing question, when does consciousness need to play a role in order for consciousness to have a function, in order for consciousness not to be epiphenomenal? So these are all questions to ask yourself about free will. What is free will? Is physical causation deterministic? If it's indeterministic, is that helpful in terms of allowing the mental to play a role? What's the relationship between the mental and the physical, such that the mental can play a role in physical events? These are all questions to ask yourself in this really vexing and perennial philosophical question.